the fluid is.
OMG.
We're talking about the brake fluid thing, and there's some stuff, I always try to put these things together so it'll teach you a little something that you thought you knew but you didn't know before, you know what I mean? And so the first thing we're looking at here is, somebody tell me, why don't we change fluids?
Helps the engine run. It get dirty.
Good answer.
Keep trash out,
Huh?
keep trash out.
Yeah, you got,
Because the lines could be rusty and.
they kind of break down too.
Transmission fluid will lose its,
Yeah, brake fluid, huh?
transmission fluid will lose its friction stuff.
It uses friction modifier, and also it turns dark and gummy and starts to make valves stick, and oil gets contaminated with acid and that kind of thing. So we got carbon, we got contaminants that accelerate the wear on seals, bearings, and various moving parts like engine oil. And we changed transmission fluid because the friction material gradually wears off the clutches, contaminates the fluid with sludge that could wear seals and jam valves. But what you basically got also about transmission fluid is if you're pulling really heavy stuff a lot with it, and it gets really, really hot, whenever transmission fluid gets really hot, it changes the properties of the fluid, and it starts making varnish and causing all kind of growth like that. We changed coolant because the corrosion inhibitors lose their effectiveness with time and miles, so we got a chemical breakdown going on, right? We also can have electrolysis taking place if the pH of the coolant gets off one way or another. Have you know the difference between acid and alkaline, right? Water is 7, acid goes down from 7, and alkaline goes up. Well, you can have alkaline batteries, you can have acid batteries. Either one works as a battery. Alkaline battery is what you got in your flashlight, acid battery is what you got in the car. But they're both batteries because there's an out of balance condition there that's causing it to flow. You know how you can get a really weak, a really sensitive voltmeter and stick both of the probes in a lemon and read voltage in a lemon? Because it's acid, right? Okay, should we change brake fluid? It means flushing it out. One of the things that's funny to me was, in the Volkswagen had a program where we were supposed to, or it might have been Mazda, when I was working at the dealer, we were supposed to change out the brake fluid. And Volkswagen sent this pressure bleeder thing, and we were actually supposed to change the brake fluid. And this one guy that I saw over there that was working on those Volkswagen would take a big syringe that he had and just suck the fluid out of the reservoir and just put new fluid in the reservoir and get paid for that whole thing. You know, whenever you're doing a recall, you need to actually do the recall. You know what I mean? Or you're going to get recall stuff, you know. No, recall stuff don't pay all that good, but it's got to be done. And I tell you how important recall stuff is, and this is a small digression. Renault, back whenever they were sort of fading away, and most of the Renaults were in junkyards, the Encore, the Alliance, that bunch of stuff, you know. They had a recall that the heater core might bust and spray hot water on your feet. And so there was a federally mandated recall on those. And so, you know, we at the time had bought the Jeep, which at the time AMC, Renault, and Jeep were all together. And so we bought it primarily to get the Jeep. Well, anyway, the Renault people got a hold of the service manager, and he was wanting us to, they were wanting us to go to salvage yards and drag cars out of the junkyard and change the heater core in them, so that they could have the requisite number of cars, the recall done on. You see, the dealer is, the manufacturer is responsible for getting those recalls done, a certain percentage by a certain date, and that's what they were concerned about. Now, there's a difference between a recall and a program and all this kind of stuff. That's another thing. So brake fluid doesn't have any combustion or friction materials to generate harmful byproducts. It doesn't have, it's a sealed system, so air, moisture, and other contaminants technically can't get in there, right? Well, I see the difference between like the differential lube in the rear end. Most vehicles, most I'm gonna say, will drive the life of that vehicle and then some without ever changing the differential grease, unless it leaks out or some kind of problem like that. Or automatic manual transmission fluid. You don't typically change that because there's nothing going on in there. Automatic transmission fluid is a different critter. Engine oil is a different one. You know, that kind of thing. Even power steering. You know how to flush a power steering system? You know how to do that?
You talked about it before, but I can't remember.
Take the return line off.
Take the return line off. You're gonna basically take the return line off and put it in a pan and cap off the the nipple where you pull the return line off of, so that nothing can come out of there. And keep adding fluid and turning the wheel back and forth until clear fluid comes out, then you got after fluid in there. And while there's not really a maintenance interval for that in any of your manuals, or your owner's manual or anything, the manufacturers, a lot of them like GM, has got a procedure for doing it, if you decided you want to do that. All right, so some manufacturers recommend changing brake fluid, so why do others recommend against it?
Possible to introduce air and contaminants into it if you don't do it properly, I'm guessing.
Maybe, but yeah, and I, like I told, talking about Papa G's truck, whenever I flushed his, it broke some stuff loose and wound up having to put a unit on it, you know? Well, there was a study that was done by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, and you don't want to mess with those guys because they'll, you know, clean your plow if you get out of line a little too much. And it was initiated in 1998 in response to vehicle owners' complaints that operation of performance of the ABS system. All right, so they found deposits of what looked like corrosion residue in some ABS control valves, so they asked the researchers to study how brake fluid ages while it's in a brake system, hoping to learn how it influences corrosion. And that's basically what some of the stuff looked like that you see in there, the little gummy stuff, you know. All right. So if you look at the history here, whenever hydraulic brakes were first developed in the 1920s, the only material available for seals, hoses, and other hydraulic parts was natural rubber. All right, so the first brake fluid was a mixture of castor oil and alcohol. Sounds okay, right? All right, so why the castor oil?
Because the alcohol evaporates too quick.
And it also boils really easy, right? You know that, so the castor oil would raise the boiling
Could
point.
explode.
Yeah. Well, there is another, and it changes the viscosity of it too. But something else you got in Siberia, where 60 below zero temperatures are really common in the winter, even more common now than they were, you know, since the Antarctic ice cap is growing, getting bigger, and the Arctic cap is and all that, everything's getting colder. This thing, the Russians, kids, still walk to school even though it's 60 below zero, because humans are really adaptable. You know what I'm saying? They're tough. Those kids are tough. They're used to go. Oh, my dad said when he was in Korea, he went around, it was 50 below zero, and everybody's all bundled up. And then it warmed up to 10 below, and all those GIs were out there in t-shirts because it felt like it was so warm. And it was 10 below, you know? But I mean, one way or another, you get used to anything. But the vehicle, if you take a crescent wrench or any other piece of steel, like a snap-on wrench or whatever, at 60 below zero, you drop it on concrete, it shatters like a piece of glass. And you got no wrench. So you gotta be careful about dropping your wrenches at 60 below zero. Electric welding apparatus will not work at 60 below zero because of the intense cold. So what they did was brake fluid freezes. See what I'm saying? So your brakes don't work. So what they do is they pour vodka in there because it won't freeze, you know? All right, so when synthetic elastomers and plastic parts became available, natural rubber was still in use, and brake fluid had to be compatible with everything. It could, you know, it would attack some of this stuff, okay? So a solvent would be needed so that a wider variety of fluids could be mixed together, and there were several reasonable choices. They settled on glycol ether as the standard base solvent for hydraulic brake fluid. So remember that if it comes up on a pop test, glycol ether is what they settled on for the standard base solvent for hydraulic brake fluid. Glycol ether won't attack natural or synthetic elastomers and won't make them swell and disintegrate the way some other solvents can. Now, you know, some of you guys may have pulled a cap off a master cylinder and see it all swelled up because somebody put oil in there or something that wasn't compatible. As a matter of fact, one of my guys that was, sometimes people that you know better just aren't thinking clearly and will make dumb mistakes on brake jobs. One of these guys, it was really a pretty doggone good student, and it's been, you know, 8, 9 years ago, he poured power steering fluid in the master cylinder on the Sonata and caught it about the time he's poured it in there. Oh, I don't know what I was thinking about. This same guy, and like I said, he wasn't a dummy. Sometimes he just was on autopilot, I guess. And I don't know, you may have seen this before, put the brake pads on one so that the metal part was against the rotor. Now, I've had 2 or 3 students do that. I had one student that was really a good student, that was older than me, that had done a lot of really good work, and was putting the brake pads on backwards on one. I mean, or maybe one of them. And then I asked him, I said, what were you thinking about? He goes, well, I didn't even know they'd go on there backwards. Well, they will. You can just put them right on there backwards. Make sure you got your mind on what you're doing, that's the point. Because if you get your mind on what you're doing, you can make some silly mistakes. I know, I've done it. I haven't done that, but I've done other stupid stuff, Brake fluid will attack other materials. If you ever spill brake fluid on a painted fender,
You better get it off quick.
yep, you better get it off quick, because you may see something like that. Let me see who this is. This is Richard. Call me back in about 25 minutes, because right now I'm in a class and I can't talk to you about this. All right. But anyway, the first time I ever ran into anything like this was I was working at a shop over at Enterprise when I was about 20 years old. And I was working the brake. It was like a Pontiac Le Mans or something, and the paint was a kind of a green color. And I was doing my thing here at the master cylinder and all that kind of stuff. And the guy, of course, I didn't have a fender cover on it, which you're supposed to have a fender cover. And the guy that owned the shop came over and he goes, oh no. And he saw a little bit of brake fluid laying there that I didn't even know had spilled on the paint. And when he wiped it off, the paint came with it. But he just jumped. I mean, you're not supposed to wipe it with a rag. If you get water, if you do see brake, nowadays with the clear coat they got, it's a little tougher than the paint used to be. But if you spill that brake fluid on the paint and you caught that you've done that, hit it with a water hose and wash it off. Don't wipe it. Just leave it, just wash it off with a water hose. But anyway, you can see this. And anybody that's ever spilled brake fluid on anything painted out here, if it was like stripes on the floor or whatever, it comes right on up. It typically will. All right, so brake fluid, the way they build it now, has got low viscosity, high boiling point, so it flows about the same way over a wide temperature range. You don't want your brake fluid changing viscosity as it gets hotter, because there's going to be a lot of temperature changes there. You don't want it being all sluggish and slow when you're trying to stop in the wintertime either. See what I mean? So you want the viscosity to be the same over a wide range. All right, you got polyglycol lubricants, solvent modifiers that make the fluid compatible with a wide range of elastomers, along with other additives. And some of them are corrosion inhibitors, pH stabilizers, and antioxidants. So basically you're trying to keep the brake fluid from getting more acid or more alkaline. That's what your pH stabilizer is about. Corrosion inhibitors, it's obvious that that's why you need those. My phone won't leave me alone. This is Richard. Hey, yeah. She hasn't given me one yet, but bill it out and bring it, and I will write the PO until you get here. All right. More additives or, corrosion resistant. I was trying to repeat what I already said. Never mind. Phone messed me up. Most of the corrosion in a brake system is caused by environmental contaminants like water, salt, and oxygen. You got that? Water, salt, and oxygen. Of course, water is going to cause it just like oxygen does. Wheel cylinders and calipers are in the environment, and they got heat cycles that can distort the sealing surfaces and where contaminants are most likely to enter the brake system. So if it gets cold and hot and cold and hot and cold and hot, it changes shape, right? And it doesn't seal as good, where the boots and everything are, where you're supposed to be keeping everything out. And that right there is a picture of a wheel cylinder, so on and so forth. Okay? Now, think about this. Without ABS, brake fluid doesn't circulate through the system unless you're bleeding the brakes, right? Basically, if the brakes are bled and you don't have ABS, all the fluid's doing is moving back and forth a little bit. What's the difference? We've talked about ABS enough to where if you've got one of these highfalutin ABS systems with the four-wheel anti-lock or whatever, it actually is going to take fluid and just move it all over the place. The pump kicks in, it goes back and forth and all around about. Most of the time, it acts like the brake fluid doesn't move very much at all. It moves just a little bit, and then it comes back. See? So, anyway, that's some of the examples of corrosion parts on your ABS system. All right, you got some other factors here. And about a third of the test vehicles that the Highway Safety Transportation Board people did, corrosion was found on parts made of ferrous metals. In many of the corrosion, the pits in the corrosion were filled with copper. When they looked at it at a microscopic level, they found out it had corroded and they'd refilled with copper. Now, what do you suppose caused that?
The brake line is breaking down?
Yeah. And some brake lines are soldered with copper. The copper in the brake lines corrodes at a slow rate over months or years and results in copper ions in the brake fluid, and they act like oxidizers and plate out in the ABS valves, and the corrosion inhibitors in fluid can no longer prevent corrosion of the ferrous components. Did any of you guys in science class, when you were in high school, do a experiment with electroplating?
No.
Well, we did. I mean, science class is different now than what it used to be, I guess. But we basically got a solution, and we put a key, and we put a piece of copper in there, and we basically positively charged one and negatively charged the other one and left it there overnight. And this key was a brass key, but it was coated with copper the next morning. We had electroplated the key. And this kind of happens automatically, you know, when you get situations like this going on. All right, and so this right here is a little bit of copper, you know, transfer going on right there. You can see on that thing. All right. The copper ions become the oxidizer that corrodes the parts made of iron and steel. What does copper do? Have you ever seen anybody, here's another thing, have you ever seen anybody that when they were trying to keep their battery terminals from getting all chalked up, they would throw a couple of copper pennies on top of the battery? Just lay pennies on the battery, and what happens is those pennies take up all of that, you know, the pennies will get all chalked up and everything, but the battery terminals kind of stay clean. But you got to use pennies that are copper. You can't use that hogwash you're putting out now that's got zinc in it that's colored like copper. It's got to be an actual copper penny or any piece of copper. If you just lay it up there, the corrosion just goes to it, something fierce. And they really couldn't make computer CPUs out of copper until they figured out a way to keep it from corroding, because copper loves to corrode. That's why they made them out of aluminum for a long time. All right. So measuring the electrical conductivity of brake fluid is another way to check corrosive properties. Electrical conductivity. Okay, so electrical conductivity is a measure of its ability to transport electric charge. Yep, metals have high conductivity. When copper ions are added in a concentration, remember this, it may be on the test tomorrow. 25% of the maximum allowed for DOTS brake fluid, the conductivity increased more than 6 times. Well, that's going to cause ionization, right? You got that? All right, so that's the smoking gun. That's the smoking gun. The National Highway Transportation Safety Board says this is the reason why brake fluid needs to be flushed. To get rid of that, right? All right. Justify changing the brake fluid. And I left a space out right there, and it annoys the ever-living daylights out of me when I leave a space out there. Measure the conductivity, and I left another way out. And a vehicle will give the measure of the fluid's copper content, which will indicate the condition of the fluid's corrosion inhibitors. And has anybody ever done that here?
Measured it.
Yep.
I did, yeah, just
We
today.
did that for the strips.
Yep. You remember what fast car stands for? Can you remember it?
Fluid analysis by stimulation of copper alpha reactions.
Fluid analysis stimulated by what?
Fluid
Stimulation
analysis by
of copper
stimulation of
alpha
copper.
reactions. That's pretty cool stuff. Phoenix Systems done for that. And, now those test strips, a little thing of them cost about $70. That's like 75 strips for $70 or something like that. But I tell you what, it's a pretty doggone good upsell if you got a shop that you're actually, when you're doing this dip strip, if it's showing that it's deep purple, you know, you can actually use that for a good launching pad for we need to flush your brake system. And the way you do that is, I'm going to put a hose and a bottle on all 4 wheels, and I'm just going to keep adding fluid. Have you ever seen my trick about taking the drink bottle that you already washed out good, so you know, and fill this big old drink bottle up with brake fluid, and then turn it upside down in the master cylinder reservoir where it's like a chicken house water. You know, so whenever you're pumping your brake fluid through there, it'll gurgle down in that bottle. It acts kind of like a sight glass, and it also increases the capacity of the reservoir, so you don't have to jump out or have, you know, what's his name come over here and fill it up for you while you're, you know, keep on pumping it, until everything comes out clear, then you flushed it, you know, if you use good clean brake fluid and all that kind of stuff. All right, so the brake fluid constantly corrodes the copper. Copper leaches into the brake fluid as ions, atoms with an electrical charge, and when the corrosion inhibitors in the brake fluid wear out, as they always do, the copper ions become the oxidizer that corrodes the parts made of iron and steel. All right, now you got a color change, you know, brake fluid, you get a color change up there. All right, the color of brake fluid changes, everybody's seen that. So what does the color change mean, and what should you do about it? You can't go by the color change. Now I noticed that some of the dip strip results that we got, you guys were probably dipping into brake fluid that was pretty ugly, but it didn't really turn all that dark of a color. I mean, it didn't change to, it went to pink, didn't it? Didn't you say your dip strip went to pink, it didn't go to all the way to purple and all that. So you identifying color changes in the shop is difficult because so many different chemical changes are possible that the color change is almost meaningless. Doesn't matter if the fluid's the color that you don't like, it may not be anything that matters. So without some kind of test equipment, there's no way to know the condition of the brake fluid.
Is there a voltage you're looking for if you're just measuring it with a multimeter?
Yeah, that what we were looking for is 0.3 of a volt or less.
But anything after that, you want to change it.
Yeah, I mean, that'd be a good plan with that. And that also, initially, what I read on that was you're actually measuring moisture content, but in addition to that, you're bound to be measuring this other thing here. But if it's more than 0.3 of a volt in there, you know, it means basically you've got, it's like you've got an acidic mixture in there that's basically going to start corroding things. Just, it's a good idea to do that. And what does it mean when something is hygroscopic?
It repels water.
That's right. It absorbs water, which is what brake fluid does. Brake fluid absorbs water in a big way. How many of you guys have poured brake fluid out of the gallon jug of brake fluid that we got here and just lift the lid off? That's not a good plan. Always put the lid back on it to keep the moisture and the air out of the brake fluid. Somebody back there thinks that's funny for some reason, I don't know why. But, the measurement of the brake fluid's chemistry is a better indication of the potential for corrosion, but brake system corrosion still cannot be accurately determined regardless, only predicted based on worst case conditions, basically. In other words, you're not going to have it's not the kiss of death just because it failed some of these tests, as long as the brakes work right. I thought it was really weird. There was this old man that was a welder that worked with me down there. His name was D.D. Crane. He's long since passed away. A little spiky-haired, gray-haired guy. And he said him and his family, they were out there somewhere on a long trip on a Chrysler or something they were driving. And something happens where he lost all his brake fluid. I don't remember what it was. He didn't tell me that. But he found himself out there with no brakes and no brake fluid because the brake fluid was all gone. And he's a pragmatist. You know what a pragmatist is?
Somebody that thinks everything.
Somebody that if you do it, if it works, that's what you do. You know, this is going to work, so this is what we'll do. All right. And he told me, he says, I went and got some cups and all, and he says, and I poured the whole brake system full of water and bled it out, just like it was brake fluid. And he says, and I drove it home. Just poured water in it, you know? I mean, granted, it's probably not the safest thing in the world, but it's safer driving with that than it was without brakes. And he said when he got home, you know, he bled it out, never had any more trouble. I mean, he ran brake fluid and pushed all the water out. It sounded horrible, but he didn't have ABS back then either. There's another guy that I was reading about. It said this guy, he was working at a gas station, and this guy pulled in on the lift, just drove right into the lift and pulled on the lift and says, and he said, well, what are you doing here? He said, well, I've blown a wheel cylinder on one of my wheels. And he says, what I want to do is, he said, I know how to handle this. So he says, okay, you know, you want to handle it yourself. And so the guy had him raise it up on the lift, and over where the brake line was going into the wheel cylinder, he beat the line flat. Just beat it flat so no fluid could go in there. That took care of the brake fluid leak, right? So he got into the car, and when he backed out, he went off down in the ditch. And the guy from the filling station that wrote this little piece ran down there and says, what's going on? That guy says, I don't understand it. The other 3 times when I did this, it worked just fine. He had beat his last brake line flat and thought everything, he probably had a real good pedal. I mean, that's not a joke, it's a true story, you know. Anyway, some manufacturers recommend flushing the hydraulic system, including ABS valves every 2 years. So, geography, you got external factors. Vehicles in humid climates, particularly those in the Rust Belt states, will eventually suffer corrosion in the hydraulic system due to moisture contamination, mostly at the calipers and wheel cylinders. You see brake lines like that, you gotta remember those lines are carrying 2,000 pounds of pressure. And they can start spraying fluid without warning. And I've had it, I had it happen on cars I've driven before. I mean, the Volkswagen Rabbits, that had them older ones that had the brake lines going under the carpet, had it happen on one of them. And of course, that was not the one that the park brake broke. It managed to stop me out down at the intersection when I got under the truck. But the simple fact is, if you see brake lines like that, you're doing somebody a disservice if you don't say, look, these brake lines need to be replaced. I know it's gonna be expensive, but somebody's gonna die if you don't replace your brake lines. And like I say, in the pickups where they ride in the frame rail and mud stays in there and all that, you're gonna wind up with issues because of that too. So,
Can't you tell, can't you make them throw the vehicle away if it's bad enough?
well, if you lay a wrench on it and you start working on it, then it becomes your responsibility. But now when I say that, if you're working on the brake system and you're fooling with the lines, but if you say, these right here need to be replaced because if these things rupture, and they could rupture any minute, you could basically tell them. Now, when you're taking it apart and you find all kind of haywired crap and all that kind of stuff, and they say, well, I don't want it fixed, that's when you put it on tell them to come get it with a wrecker because you're not willing to drive it away. This is slightly different unless you've already worked on it. If you see that, that's when you stop and say, we can't do anything else, so let's replace the brake lines. And if you take it, with you, it's on you. But that's really nasty business right there. Because these things corrode. We don't live in a rust belt state. Vehicles don't rust all that bad around here. The ones that have the salt on the roads and all that. When I was harvesting wheat out there, I'd go where I was born, and I'd hire all these wheat harvesters, and I'd go up the country. And out in Texas, north central Texas, cars don't rust. I mean, they rust more here than they do there. So I went out there, and I was out there at the farm, where we get ready to, had to pour the combine apart and all that kind of stuff. And out in the grass behind the farmhouse, there were a bunch of mid to late 50s model cars sitting out there in the grass that looked brand new. I mean, the grass was growing about halfway up the doors. And I walked out there and I said, well, there's a 55 Oldsmobile and there's a 57 Pontiac. Man, these cars look really good. And so I opened the door and the carpet looked brand new and the chrome threshold was just perfect and the dash looked good and no broke glass. A bunch of them sitting out there. Must have been 5 or 6 of them. Now there were some other ones that were crappy looking sitting out there, but these really look nice cars. Well, I went and asked my boss man, I said, what the heck is all these cars sitting out here for? I mean, they look brand new. He said, every one of them's got a blown engine. Because Tommy Ray was kind of crazy. He didn't wreck no cars, he just blew the engines up in them. And that's where they got parked after he blew the motor up in them. In those days you could buy a used car, a nice one for like, $600-800, But the long and the short of it was, I always says, I bet if I could have took those cars and put engines in them and fixed them up, you could have, this was car show quality cars now. They had blown engines in them, everyone. He just get another car when he blew the engine. But the long and the short of it was there was no rust out there. That's the point. You didn't have the paint even looked good. That's the end of the slideshow. Click to exit. All right. So tell me something you learned that you didn't know when you sat down here. That's what I'm trying to do, is teach you something you didn't know when you came in here.
That one,
Cars don't rust in Texas.
Huh?
Cars don't rust in Texas.
Whenever I ask that question, have you ever noticed that whenever I say, what did you learn, that he always feeds back to me the last thing I said before? Like nothing before that sunk in. Something you learned from earlier in the presentation, what you got?
when brake lines and stuff start pitting, they fill up with copper.
Yeah, or on the inside, not on the outside, but on the inside.
You can temporarily stop a car with water.
Yep,
You
temporarily.
can put pennies on your
yeah.
battery.
Huh?
You can put pennies on your battery and keep the terminal from corroding.
Yeah, copper likes to absorb stuff.
So you can just put the pennies anywhere on the battery?
Just lay it up on the battery, about that far from each post. And you'll be surprised how fast they'll get all chalky. Now, I'm not gonna say, if your battery's already chalky, they're not gonna cause that chalk to go away. You're gonna have to clean the chalk off first. And
So how would the pennies stay there? Would you glue them?
No, you just lay there, just let them lay there, they ain't gonna work.
Even if you go around the curve something bad, or the pennies won't slide?
Not usually, because most
JP
time,
won't.
yeah, they're kinda dug in, you know.
I would get a hot new